Testing, one, two, three. Okay. Hopefully, microphone is working. We got about 20 pages into it on chapter 3 yesterday. And I think we can finish it up today. And if we have time left, we'll start chapter 4. So, where I sort of left off, although probably before that, is the section called Strategic Abdication. The absence of large-scale capital in a particular sector can be just as indicative of capitalism's overall dynamics as its present. Abdication is a strategy by which capital relinquishes responsibility for production where risks are too high and rewards too uncertain, as they often are in nature-based sectors. You could make this argument for other kinds of activities under regional capitalism. But anyway, if capital does not often organize agricultural production directly, it is not absent from agriculture writ large, nor from related processes of accumulation, as we can see when we take a step back to look at the cycle of production and accumulation more broadly. Where suprassumption makes production itself too irregular or risky, capitalists tend to operate at a distance, investing upstream or downstream from direct cultivation in biotechnology or fertilizer, tools or seeds, processing or finance. The oddities of nature-based production mean that it's often better, financially speaking, to own seed patents or a food processing plant and leave the trouble of actually growing crops or catching fish to someone else. Most agribusiness grants are really industrial producers of one kind or another. Monsanto manufactures chemical, Bayer makes seeds, Driscoll's packs berries, Tyson packs meat. These firms don't produce the berries or the beef or the corn. They manufacture the inputs that go into them or process the raw harvest that comes out. Other interventions come at the point of circulation, where many of agriculture's temporal and spatial disjunctures are more easily evened out. Technologies from refrigerated train cars to motorized container ships can make seasonal produce available year-round and worldwide. Finance, fundamentally a tool for managing temporal disjunctions, can hedge between unpredictability through instruments like grain futures. Lenders who advance funds for farmers to buy seeds or equipment can usually recoup costs regardless of how the crop turns out. Merchants who offer access to consumer markets can often set the terms of exchange. Even where agricultural production itself is not internally organized along capitalist lines, then it's not plausibly understood as non-capitalist. Most agriculture in most of the world is still dominated by relatively small producers. They're not entirely dispossessed of the means of production as we expect proletarians to be. They typically own tools and instruments and sometimes even their own land and machinery. They only occasionally sell their labor and maintain nominal control over what and how they produce. Yet even small producers who own their own land and use little technology do not produce autarkically or for subsistence alone, but for a vast global market. However, however independent their work may appear, they too are engaged in social labor connected by the market and directed by price signals. Small farmers and peasants, just as much as wage workers, are effectively laboring for people they do not know, producing goods they will never see in their final form. And they too are dominated by capitalists simply through a different mechanism. Here, the social power of capital is exerted through unequal relationships of exchange, even though the parties don't appear in the classical form of worker and employer who together enter the sphere of production, period. Domination appears instead in the form of the monopsony power of buyers, the lending power of financiers, the price-setting power of middlemen over the producers who depend on them for access to markets and credit. Labor is exploited indirectly and at a distance via market instruments like debt and buying power. Now, although these small producers technically retain control over production, they're not really independent of capital in any meaningful sense. Their decisions are informed by both the general pressures of market rule and the direct pressures imposed by powerful commercial intermediaries. Indeed, what I've called commercial subsumption is pervasive in nature-based sectors. It describes the position of the matsutake picker who sells mushrooms to a middleman, and that of the rancher who sells calves to industrial feedlots, as well as that of many other small producers. Take as an illustration cocoa production. Today, most cocoa is grown by West African and South American smallholders who sell to a tiny number of global processing giants. Together, three firms account for about 60% of the world cocoa trade via highly financialized markets mediated by brokers. Heavy speculation on cocoa prices feeds back into cocoa production, pressuring farmers to turn over crops more quickly, resulting in lower quality cocoa and worse working conditions. The cocoa farmers don't have a boss in the way that factory workers do. No one is keeping an eye on their pace or telling them to take a shorter lunch break, let alone monitoring their behavior when they're off the job, so to speak. But they are exploited by capital nonetheless. Abdication also serves as an important strategy for managing labor in nature-based industries where natural agents fail to act as autocrats, so to speak, facilitating capital's domination of the labor process. And as we've seen, the design of the machinery, the assembly line, the shop floor, and other material components of the factory all serve to discipline and order labor and enforce managerial imperatives. Where nature isn't reliable, however, it's harder to ensure that workers will be. While it's possible for workers to use natural recalcitrance to their advantage, as Malm suggests, more often it serves as an impetus to sweat labor in whatever way necessary. As suggested by Marx's example of the pottery workshop where children work late into the night. Where capital fails to master nature and exert total command over production, in other words, social strategies for deploying and controlling labor become more important. In these instances, the basic elements of capitalist domination, that is, market rule and class rule, continue to operate, but they're aligned differently than they are in the really subsumed factory. Two configurations are particularly significant in nature-based sectors, what I call market management and market subordination. Next section, outsourced domination. What Alyssa calls market management describes instances where the force of market rule is built directly into the structure of payment, such that the market operates as a force for managing and disciplining labor. Now, in the factory, capital can ensure that workers are working for every minute of their shift. It can design the production line, place managers in strategic locations, and perhaps more importantly, control the pace of production by setting the speed of the machine. In the field, however, you can't keep strawberries coming down the line. You can't, in other words, be sure that a worker paid by the hour won't mosey through the field picking at their leisure. Where capital can't control the pace of labor through the machine and the cost of human supervision is prohibitively high, perhaps because workers are mining coal deep underground or logging lumber in a distant part of a vast forest. Paying wages pegged to time is a fool's errand. Instead, capital makes use of structures of payment to time. Instead, capital makes use of structures of payment that subject workers to market rule directly. Piecework, contract labor, sharecropping. With piecework wages, for example, workers are paid by the number of goods they produce. Since workers paid by the piece will scramble to produce as much as they can, Marx observes this form of payment usefully renders supervision of labor superfluous. Indeed, as the historian Andrew Liu notes, payment by the piece is often more conducive to the intensification of labor than payment by the wage, since it incentivizes workers to speed up of their own accord. Sharecropping operates similarly, offering workers a share of profits rather than a fixed wage, and thus mobilizing labor through sheer force of market rule. Small producers thus tend to be embroiled in what Mike Davis calls a relentless micro-capitalism subjected to vicious market competition and driven to rationalize their own labor. Relying on market management instead of directly hiring and managing labor also helps to offload the physical and financial risks that attend particularly volatile natural processes. Logging output, for example, tends to be uncertain and uneven as a result of unpredictable weather patterns, uncontrollable forest geographies. Logging is also a notoriously dangerous job, resulting in high rates of industry and death for workers and corresponding costs to employers. Contract logging, in which mills and other forest-based producers enter into agreements with small independent logging operators, allows the former to displace responsibility for both the quantity of output and the safety of workers to the latter. Sharecropping similarly operates as a form of insurance, distributing risk of crop failure caused by bad weather or natural disaster across those who lease a plot of land. A second form of labor management operates through interpersonal and even intimate, ostensibly extra-economic relationships which enable forms of discipline that aren't available within the formal labor contract, typically backed by explicit power and even violence. Indeed, outright coercion and brutality have often been common tools for managing agricultural labor. See India. Forms of commercial agriculture have typically developed under conditions of settler capitalism in which land expropriated from indigenous peoples is worked by unfree laborers, enslaved laborers, indentured servants, convicts, debt-bonded laborers. The plantation, one of the original sites of quasi-industrial agriculture, operated as a kind of human machine, one that developed elements of Taylorism avant la lettre by closely monitoring labor productivity and enforcing labor discipline through sheer violence. Overseers kept watch over the pace of labor in the fields, but the threat of physical punishment or sale served to intimidate enslaved laborers even where these managers were absent or distant. Thus, in the context of capitalist slavery, Michael Gorup argues the impersonal domination of the market exacerbated rather than undercutting the personal domination of the master, a condition he describes as market subjection. Footnote 106. Chattel slavery is an extreme case of the interaction between market rule and direct domination, but forms of market rule exercised through often despotic kinds of interpersonal power, a combination I described riffing on Gorup as market subordination, are prevalent in nature-based production more broadly, and they have persisted long after chattel slavery's demise. Market subordination is sometimes facilitated by particularly coercive market instruments, as in the forms of debt bondage and peonage, historically so prevalent in nature-based industries like agriculture, fishing, and domestic service. In these cases, wages are formally exchanged for labor, but at such an extreme imbalance as to render some people subject to the virtually unchecked authority of others in near perpetuity. In other cases, that was footnote 107. In other cases, ostensibly non-economic institutions like the family act as what I call paracapitalist agents, that is, agents that are able to do work that capital itself cannot. By leaving the organization of production to such agents, capital tacitly enables the discipline of ambiguously free laborers by often coercive means. That is, the family has been a particularly reliable institution for managing formally subsumed labor more generally. The book Capital is littered with examples of mothers and children working long hours in home-based production. As one of the few status-based institutions sanctioned by liberalism, moreover, the family is able to make use of forms of discipline that are unavailable within the ostensibly non-coercive employee-employer relationship. Such instances in which production for the market is internally structured by status relationships and enforced by interpersonal domination are sometimes described as the patriarchal regime of production. But if the family has often proved valuable in managing small-scale production more generally, it has particular advantages in agriculture. The family is the useful source of the flexible labor that the seasonal variations of agriculture require, since family members can be available to work year-round without continually being paid wages. They can be compensated with basic reproduction and commandeered into service when needed. Indeed, while the intense labor of family farming is often characterized as a form of self-exploitation, Susan Mann notes that it is better understood as a form of patriarchal domination in which male heads of household compel women and children to work, often through uses of corporal punishment barred to formal employers. As in the market subjection of chattel slavery, then, these instances of patriarchal domination are not rooted only in interpersonal power, but exacerbated and indeed recast by market rule. If relationships of direct domination are particularly useful in compelling and disciplining labor on a relatively small scale, the level of the family farm or the fishing boat on a larger scale, nature-based production tends to rely on the coercive power of the state. Migrant labor, subject to distinctively political forms of subordination, is indispensable as a form of seasonal waged labor in many nature-based sectors, including nearly all industrialized agriculture. In some cases, guest worker programs explicitly delineate a class of workers with limited rights and little political power. In others, undocumented migrants are constituted as a source of flexible and easily disciplined labor through the threat of deportation. See the current situation. As these examples suggest, legal and political mechanisms for obtaining and disciplining labor often interact with and reinforce more informal patterns of racialization and social differentiation. It is telling that in this respect that the term racial capitalism originated in a study of South African gold mining, a sector based on extraction marked by various natural peculiarities in its own right, and reliant on Black workers performing semi-slave labor in the mines on a seasonal basis. This brief catalog of non-standard forms of discipline deployed to manage labor in the face of natural obstacles to real subsumption is hardly exhaustive. Nor are these mechanisms mutually exclusive. Industrial fishing boats make use of debt-bonded migrant labor. Agricultural processing behemoths buy produce from family farms that pay undocumented laborers by the piece, and so on. The key point is that while the structure of labor is often different in agriculture and other nature-based sectors than in industry, it is radically different from the vision of independent or unalienated labor that many romanticized accounts of agrarian production suggest. See the 19th century. The structure of labor performed by the debt-bonded fishermen or the racially subordinated migrant farm worker is undoubtedly deeply coercive and often questionably legal. As such, these kinds of work have often been described in terms of modern day slavery. Yet the charge of slavery suggests that these forms of labor constitute archaic practices that have anachronistically persisted into the present, thus failing to register how capitalism has transformed forced labor. It threatens, in other words, to let capitalism off the hook for forms of brutality it claims to have left behind. Labor, in these cases, is typically exploited, though not through direct use of force, but through legal and political mechanisms, overstayed visas, contracts with hidden clauses, informal agreements that can't be adequately enforced, unpayable debt, marriage licenses. It mobilizes coercion, but also choice. That these choices are made under conditions of desperation makes them little different from the choices made by many formal wage laborers. It matters that this labor is usually ambiguously free rather than blatantly unfree, as in instances of chattel slavery. The difference in the freedom of these kinds of labor and ordinary wage labor is not so much a matter of kind as of degree. Footnote 113. As a result, these unconventional forms of labor are sometimes characterized by theorists like Yaris Manaji as little more than disguised wages. Their true character hidden beneath other forms of appearance. Yet while this frame usefully highlights the continuities between wage labor and labor deployed via other mechanisms, it threatens to overstate them. The difference between the mechanism used to compel labor does matter. Sharecropping and debt bondage are not simply wage labor disguised by ideological mystification, but rather distinctive strategies for mobilizing labor under particular material and social conditions. Piecework is useful precisely because it's different from the hourly wage and capable of addressing problems that the wage can't. So, too, does the family play a different role in managing labor than the firm, even if both are organized internally along non-market lines, making use of visible hands. Although comparing these seemingly atypical forms of labor to wage labor can be politically useful, as we'll see shortly, it can also unintentionally reify the wage as the only true measure of labor under capitalism. Now, this in turn risks inadequate attention to the reasons that non-wage labor persists, the different structure of power that characterizes it, and the different kinds of strategies that workers might adopt in response. Next section, rethinking the nature of labor. The stakes of identifying certain spaces as para-capitalist or non-capitalist, and more generally of identifying boundaries between capitalism and its outside, are often not analytical so much as political. From the Matsutake pickers described by Tsing to the Russian Mir described in Marx's late writings, small-scale agrarian production has often appeared to offer an alternative to industrial capitalism and the ecological destruction left in its wake. Footnote 115. If at least some kinds of labor or nature have evaded capital's grasp, these analyses suggest, perhaps we can too. By contrast, the argument of this chapter might appear more sobering, that capitalism and distinctively capitalist forms of domination are omnipresent, structuring even sites and forms of production that seem to stand apart from them. Now, it might seem to suggest that there is no escape from capitalism's logic and hence no viable alternative to it. Yet this conclusion assumes that one must stand outside of capitalism in order to effectively challenge it. In the classical Marxist theory of politics, by contrast, precisely the condition of being internal to capitalism that makes labor powerful. Industrialization, after all, is a double-edged sword for capital. It deprives workers of skills and exploits their labor, but it also grows their numbers and erases distinctions between them. It reveals the distance between the possibility of abundance and the reality of immiseration. It brings previously isolated workers together en masse in the in the factory where they can begin to organize collectively. The socialization of labor therefore serves paradoxically to counteract the seriality of market rule. Once atomized competitors in the market, laborers are unified by both the capitalist, whose authority interpolates them all as subordinates, and by the physical space of the factory itself, which concentrates them spatially, the assembly line, and creates the conditions for their self-organization. Footnote 116. It's precisely because production is so tightly coordinated, moreover, that industrial workers are able to disrupt it so successfully, and because capital has invested so much in machinery that disruptions are immensely costly. Thus, with the growth of industry, Marx argues, grows the revolt of the working class, a class constantly increasing in numbers and trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production. Close quote. It was precisely because the industrial proletariat had been created by capital, in other words, that they could unmake it. It's for this reason, too, that socialists have often looked upon peasants with suspicion, seeing them as archaic, sterile, or pre-political laggards from a bygone era who could neither hold back capitalism's tide nor transcend it beyond something new. Now, if we recognize that the likes of smallholders and independent producers are not plausibly thought of as standing outside of capitalism, however, the prospect of political action imminent to the system emerges. The petty producer has archetypically been seen as a conservative force, seeking only to protect their own private plot of land against the encroachment of the market. But recognition that the market has already encroached, even where people continue to own land or tools, suggests that liberation can be secured only by acting collectively with others similarly subjected to market rule and dominated by class power, whatever its particular form. From the vantage point presented here, small producers are not producing in isolation, but rather are linked by the complex interaction that compose contemporary capitalism. They might not have the same employer, but they share a common position relative to the creditors to whom they owe money, the monopolistic companies from which they buy seeds and equipment, and the industrial processors who buy their products, and have proven able to organize periodically on a massive scale to target these very institutions. The ambiguous, even contradictory class position of many producers in nature-based sectors and the dispersed and fragmented nature of production do present genuine challenges to organizing. Workers in these sectors are often isolated spatially, despite being linked economically, and cooperate directly on much smaller scales. Even the largest fishing boats, for instance, are typically minuscule in size compared with onshore processing plants. Where production is dispersed, the effect of the mass strike or shutdown is more difficult to achieve. Where relatively little capital has been invested, interruptions to work are less disruptive to accumulation. Where large-scale capital operates at a distance or through intermediaries, it may be more difficult for those subjugated by it to discern a shared enemy or to even confront one. Hence, the frequent appearance of agrarian politics in the form of populist movements rather than explicitly class struggles. Where industry once socialized production and generated mass political movements, the heterogeneity of natural processes tends to generate heterogeneous forms of labor-capital relations and, in turn, heterogeneous forms of labor politics. Yet, industrial workers, too, once seemed unorganizable. If some of the tactics of classic industrial labor politics are not immediately available to those in nature-based sectors whose work is commercially rather than really subsumed, we should not thereby conclude that political organization is impossible. Both the historical conditions of political possibility and the concrete conditions of production always both enable and constrain political tactics, strategy, and action. The task of any given moment is to understand how. In particular, it is vital to attend more closely not only to historical context, language, strategy, and other familiar features of political life, but also to the ways that materialized social relations confront people as individuals, structure them as a group, and enable or constrain certain kinds of action, and the ways that the particularities of concrete labor processes and sites of work, from material infrastructures to temporal patterns, inform political tactics and strategy. Indeed, the constraints of non-standard labor frequently spurred political creativity in their own right, and the temporal and material peculiarities of nature-based production present opportunities of their own. They might create physical choke points that are vulnerable to disruption at geographically fixed sites, like the bottlenecks exploited by British coal miners in the 1920s. The rhythms of natural processes, meanwhile, create temporal choke points in their own right. Strawberries or tomatoes that aren't harvested at exactly the right time will rot on the vines, giving workers outsized leverage at particular moments. While factories physically assemble workers en masse, producers in nature-based sectors are physically connected by the natural machine on which they work and the complex interactions of the material world itself. The alteration of the physical world through production, even that undertaken by seemingly independent actors, is itself a means of connection and potential source of association. Uniting the fishery. Yes, these challenges and possibilities come to sharp relief in an example from another nature-based sector, that is fishing. Fishing is one of the last remaining forms of large-scale, formally subsumed production, and the only form of hunting that has persisted on a commercial basis into the industrial age. Fishing resists subsumption quite simply because the ocean does. Fishers spend weeks or even months searching for autonomous, rapidly moving prey across the great expanse of the sea amid unpredictable atmospheric and oceanic conditions. Perfect storms, right? Because the reproduction of fish populations is inflected by population dynamics, climatic conditions, disease, and other factors, output often fluctuates drastically from one year to the next. Knowledge and skill are important in catching fish, but so is luck. The variability of natural conditions, from tempestuous seas to unpredictable weather, also makes fishing a particularly dangerous job. Fishers don't and can't own the sea itself, as farmers can own their land, but they do tend to lease or own their boats and other necessary equipment. They don't sell their labor by the hour or day. What they sell is their product, the fish. The cannery owner, meanwhile, doesn't tell the fisher how to fish or monitor how many hours they work. They simply buy the fish at market price, effectively buy the piece. In some cases, they might lease boats or offer loans to fishers without hiring them directly. With a cannery, this is a good deal. It means that fishers take the risks, both physically and financial, of the volatile and unpredictable production process and pay the costs of reproducing their lives during long stretches at sea. Now, if they're injured or killed on the job, they alone are responsible. If they catch fewer fish than expected, they absorb the loss. Since the fisher's compensation ultimately depends on their share of the catch, they strive to maximize their output and compete with others to sell their product. The geographical specificity of the fishery, meanwhile, and the perishability of the product mean that the cannery is often the only possible buyer and is able to set prices accordingly. Now, the result is that each fisher's cut of the catch, measured by the hour, often amounts to less than a standard wage. Because fishers tend to see themselves as independent producers, their unions have been few and far between. The International Fishermen and Allied Workers of America, the IFAWA, on the U.S. West Coast in the 1940s and 50s is a rare exception. Because they were viewed by the state as independent businessmen, their collective action was deemed illegal collusion. The IFAWA instead identified as proletarians. They insisted that their primary activity was labor. And as Banerjee might recommend, described the price that they were paid per fish as a wage price. Footnote 125. As Jeff Mann argues, this constituted a very sophisticated way of rejecting the imperative of competition among individual fishers, instead, bringing to the fore their shared domination by the canneries that loaned out equipment and purchased fish, while also organizing the traditionally waged industrial workers of the cannery. Now, if the cannery served as one point of connection, the fishery served as another. IFAWA organized across the oceanic span of the West Coast, bringing together smaller unions that had restricted membership to discrete fishing grounds. The union's boundaries were therefore defined by the spatial dynamics of the regional fishery, itself emergent from the interaction of fish populations, boat technology, ocean currents, weather patterns, and port locations. One of IFAWA's core concerns was the long-term health of the fishery, which it sought to manage directly. Fishing is notoriously plagued by the tragedy of the commons. Each individual fisher has an incentive to catch as many fish as possible, and because the ocean can't be contained, because it's a commons, no one can be prevented from doing so. To combat it, the union set internal standards for fishing and sought to restrict non-members from the fishery. They could not directly exclude non-members from fishing any given span of ocean, but they could prevent them from selling any fish they caught, which is an interesting problem regulated in different ways by different states. Because IFAWA represented both fishers and cannery workers, it could strike collective bargaining agreements with canneries to purchase only union-caught fish. Now, although fishers organized around the state of the fishery, then they did not only mobilize around the fishery. They did not, in other words, adopt the strategy that characterizes many agrarian peasant movements today of designating themselves people of the land, or in this case, of the sea, mobilizing primarily around the direct interactions with nature. Footnote 126. The state of the ocean did serve to unify fishers around a common interest, but to actually curb the pressures of seriality driving towards tragedy, that's a really good way to put that, they had to confront capital directly and exert control over the means of production more broadly. By organizing across sectors, industrial and nature-based workers alike, they recognized that the cannery was effectively everybody's boss and had to be confronted collectively. Capital itself, in other words, served as a potential point of connection between nature-based producers of raw materials and those who transformed them into finished commodities, between agriculture and industry. The success of IFAWA shouldn't be overstated. It did not transform the fishing industry or stave off fisheries' collapse. It nevertheless offers a model of organizing across sectors, supply chains, and even ecosystems, one that has all the more salience in a world dominated by global retailing giants and planetary ecological crises. For the peculiar conditions of nature-based industries beset by the phenomena of commercial subsumption and strategic abdication, today they confront a massive and growing number of workers worldwide in a logistical economy in which a small number of retail behemoths set the terms. Workers in the growing platform economy, to give just one high-profile example, are treated as independent contractors. Rideshare drivers, for instance, own their own tools, car, phone, yet remain entirely reliant on tech intermediaries for their livelihoods. Merchant capitalism has returned, the historian Nelson Lichtenstein argues, exemplified by the power of global retailers like Walmart and Amazon. But in some sectors, that's footnote 128, but in some sectors, this model of organization never left. The oddities of agricultural production then are not so much the stubborn dregs of a bygone age as the harbingers of an uncertain future, as important for understanding the politics of capitalism as any struggle within the factory. Now, conclusion to Chapter 3. Half a century on from its celebration in Le Chant du Styrine, the industrial sublime looks rather different. The 2006 film Manufactured Landscapes follows the photographer Edward Bertinsky's efforts to represent the Anthropocene in image from the kilometer-long factory in China, where 23,000 workers produce the majority of the world's clothing irons, to the massive mines and quarries from which raw materials are extracted. Where Le Chant de Styrine is tinged with the wonder and terror of the sublime, but ultimately triumphant in spirit, Manufactured Landscapes evokes foreboding. The manufactured landscape inspires awe, but also a sense of powerlessness. Although the factory is undeniably a human creation, its workings are incomprehensible. The manufactured landscape suggests simultaneously total human mastery of nature and a process beyond the control of any given human being, like the sorcerer who can no longer control what is conjured. The half century separating Le Chant du Styrine and Manufactured Landscapes is, of course, the time of the Great Acceleration. We cannot understand the astonishing transformation of our planet in this period without understanding the organization of production and of labor, which at its heart is the process of transforming nature. At the same time, we cannot fully understand the politics of labor without attending to its concrete dimensions and to the many forms it takes, from the planetary mine to the global factory, as Thea Riofrancos observes. It is hard today to believe that the industrial proletariat could stand in for the whole of humanity, as Lukács once suggested. In any case, the era of the mass worker has passed, and with it, the particular conditions of 20th century politics, for better or worse, rather than bidding farewell to the conjuncture, requires a comprehensive view of the politics of production and recognition that the politics of labor are always also the politics of nature. So that's the conclusion to chapter 3. We will see now whether we can get to chapter 4 or end right now. Okie dokie. Oh, darn. What happened? Crikey. Ah, bloody hell. Excuse me. Pardon me for a second here. Okie dokie. We'll get a start on this because we're continuing to do it. This is chapter 4. Alyssa Battistoni's new book, Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. As we know, there's an expression uh, that refers to no such thing as a free lunch, which has its own political implications. The violent paradoxes of social cost. No such thing as a free gift. In Robert Heinlein's science fiction novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress of 1966, an Earthling walks into a bar in Luna, a penal colony on the moon, and learns a lesson. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. Although the bar advertises a free meal, the promise of something for nothing is a trick. The food lures in customers, but the bar inflates the prices of drinks in order to cover the costs. Tannstoffel is the watchword on Luna, where everything is a price, even oxygen, since the lunar atmosphere is a vacuum. What you get, you pay for, a Luna resident explains. The phrase would become famous as a libertarian shibboleth, particularly after Milton Friedman used it as the title for a 1975 compilation of writings. For Friedman, the free lunch myth was epitomized by the ostensibly free goods and services provided by the welfare state, which in his view were paid for by the unjustified taxation of others' wealth. But the phrase, no such thing as a free lunch, was invoked in a radically different manner by Friedman's contemporary, that is, the left-wing ecologist Barry Commoner, who in 1971 identified it as one of the four central principles of ecology. For Commoner, the phrase neatly encapsulated the conservation principle of physics, that energy can never be created or destroyed, in combination with the ecological tenet that everything is connected, that web of, nature. It meant, in Commoner's reading, that anything human beings took from the planetary ecosystem would eventually have to be returned to it. It's telling, in fact, that the phrase originated in a science fiction story about life on the moon. A lunar colony is a good example of a closed ecological system, as will Mars be. The free lunch, in Commoner's view, was the explosion of wealth in the post-war period, while the hidden costs were metaphorical, paid not in dollars, but in starkly material terms, that is, polluted air, deteriorating ecosystems, depleted resources, diminishing health. Where on Luna, even oxygen comes with a price, on Earth, Commoner sought to reveal the biophysical cost lurking beneath prices measured in monetary terms. Commoner's analysis implies a corollary. There is no such thing as a free gift. Like the free lunch, the free gift of nature is an illusion. Its costs always appear somewhere else in the system. The question is not whether they're paid, but what form they take and who or what pays them. Pollution has often been described by its defenders as the price of progress, with the implication that it's worth paying. Those who have actually paid the costs have often disagreed. Since the advent of the industrial era, the noise, smoke, soot, dust, and other effluents generated by production have frequently generated complaints, concern, and outright conflict. It is striking, then, that pollution is largely absent from Marx's work, particularly given that he wrote Capital, the book, in the midst of London's legendary coal smoke fogs, which his contemporaries, Charles Dickens and Herman Melville, felt compelled to describe. Instead, it would be Marx's lifelong contributor, collaborator, Frederick Engels, who described in agonizing detail the burden of pollution, waste, and disease borne by the working class and the condition of the working class in England of 1845. In Manchester and surrounding factory towns, Engels observed the pall of smoke hung in the air and coated buildings, while tannery buildings, dye works, bone mills, and gas works discharged filth, both liquid and solid, into the river Irk and belched forth black smoke from their chimneys. Workers suffered from typhus and cholera, struggled to breathe properly, and died much younger than they ought. Those living in the poorest parts of town were twice as likely to die as those in wealthy ones. In Engels' view, this constituted social murder. If society places hundreds of workers in such a position that they inevitably come to premature and unnatural ends, he argued, their death is as violent as if they had been stabbed or shot. The problem, however, was that this kind of violence was rarely recognized as such. Everyone is responsible, and yet no one is responsible, Engels wrote, because it appears as if the victim has died from natural causes. For Engels, the disguised, malicious nature of social murder required all the more vigilance in identifying its culprit, and the vehemence with which he condemned it was a way of bringing it to light. Engels wrote as pollution was being politicized in industrial and urban settings a century before it became a truly mass political issue. But the political challenges that he identified have only grown starker. The effects of pollution are today even more maldistributed than in Engels' time and now manifest on a global scale. Its harms, too, are perhaps more disguised than ever. While the filth and smoke that choked Manchester were tangible to all, many other kinds of harmful matter, like the chemicals and pesticides, go unseen. Some, like carbon dioxide, are imperceptible to human senses altogether. Efforts to politicize these conditions have tended to constitute variations on Marx's theme, on Engels' theme, calling attention to both the violence they do and to the disparity of their effects. Politically, pollution is perhaps most widely understood as a problem of justice in the distribution of harms. For decades, environmental justice activists and scholars have drawn attention to the disproportionate siting of landfills, incinerators, chemical plants, livestock excrement, and other deleterious facilities in working class communities and communities of color. Within political theory and philosophy, too, environmental bads have overwhelmingly been considered through the lens of distributive justice, considered in terms of racial and global disparities, as well as in terms of the temporal distribution of risks and harms across present and future generations. Critiques of unequal burdens are often paired with efforts to expose the severity of their effects, often through rhetorical means, as in Rob Nixon's influential characterization of pollution as a form of slow violence, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space. Efforts to hold specific perpetrators accountable have frequently drawn on language reminiscent of that of social murder. The United Farm Workers described pesticides as poison in the fields. The union leader, Tony Mazzocchi of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union charged that murder was being committed in the workplace. Sartre charged French mine operators with homicide of workers who developed silicosis. Moral philosophers, meanwhile, have leveled similar charges at the level of the individual, arguing that complicity in slow violence is widespread and seeking to allocate responsibility for the harms associated with personal consumption. These diagnoses do essential work to disclose the politics lurking within seemingly amorphous miasmas and to expose their troubling effects. There are indisputably stark and disturbing disparities in the distribution of environmental harms, which are quite plausibly understood in terms of violence. Pollution really does attack people's bodily integrity, undermine their physical function, cause injury, and even early death. Yet, while critiques of the unequal and unjust distribution of pollution rightly identify its harmful effects, they often stop short of adequately tracing its causes. Efforts to more explicitly attribute blame, meanwhile, tend to oversimplify their charges in service of moral clarity. The charge of social murder is galvanizing and illuminating in crucial respects. And yet, contra Engels, it is different to be killed by air pollution or by a hurricane intensified by climate change than to be stabbed or shot, which isn't to say that it's not as bad. The difference, moreover, isn't located only in the geographically and temporally diffuse character of slow violence, though these too are important. It is also rooted in the ways that these harms are produced, not by individual actors intentionally inflicting interpersonal injuries on others, but as an accidental effect of actions undertaken for different purposes altogether. The problem, frequently named as social murder or slow violence, is, in other words, a particularly visceral form of the unintended consequences generated by market rule. Critics of complicity are right that we are all implicated in these harms to some degree. Yet this is largely because so many of our decisions are mediated by markets in ways that constitutively exclude social cause and divorce our actions from their effects. Although consumption is the most common culprit for pollution, moreover, its more significant origin is elsewhere, that is, in production. Indeed, pollution largely emerges from exactly the same production process as the commodity. The same process that generates a car, for example, also generates smoke, ash, carbon dioxide, and other material byproducts. Unlike the commodity, however, this byproduct has no exchange value. And unlike the free gift of nature, it has no use value either. Pollution, then, is a odder phenomenon than it is often recognized. As the anthropologist Mary Douglas has argued, pollution cannot be understood in its strictly material terms, as smoke or dirt or even excrement, but only as the byproduct, a systematic ordering and classification of matter. Pollution is matter out of place, that is, matter that is not where it is supposed to be. This is footnote 17. In Douglas's view, social classifications of matter typically reflect a divide between the sacred and the profane. But this distinction can't hold in capitalism after all, which after all is notorious for profaning the sacred. Footnote 18. In a system where matter is ordered by prices, pollution is matter without a price. It is surplus matter, not simply surplus in an absolute sense, but matter in excess of what can be bought and sold. Pollution is the underside of the free gift's spontaneous and seemingly limitless bounty. Well, the laboriously manufactured detritus that no one has agreed to buy and no one wants. Pollution is, in the words of the economist J.H. Dales, something that no one will either pay for or accept as a gift. It is the poison that lurks within the gift. Capital's control over production, then, is also control over what that is what Alyssa calls byproduction, control over what is produced unintentionally, which is not to say unknowingly. It's all too easy for capital to abdicate responsibility for the effects of byproduction. Expelling surplus matter by default is costless. If surplus matter has no buyers, however, it nevertheless has consumers, as Commoner's second ecological law asserts. That is, everything must go somewhere. Waste does not simply disappear because it's not valued economically. The ability to impose pollution on others is another aspect of class rule. And the inability to refuse it is a form of unfreedom in its own right. The harms named as pollution or slow violence, then, should be read as the unintentional but no less systematic consequence of a particular organization of social relations expressed in and through the material world, one that consistently compels us to treat ecological effects as costless. Now, this chapter then looks at how pollution has been represented in economic terms via the concept of the externality. Externalities occur when economic activity causes costs for third parties that are not reflected in the costs to the producer, such that they are not taken into account in economic decisions. In retrospect, the externality is plausibly the most significant economic concept of the 20th century, first conceptualized in 1920 to describe minor flaws in the market, like the unpriced external effect of smoky chimneys on laundry. By the early 21st century, it would be described as the cause of a phenomenon that threatens to end human civilization as we know it. In turn, footnote 22. In turn, it has animated the core policy frameworks of late 20th century environmental politics, most obviously via carbon taxes and cap and trade programs, and has been taken up in many theories of just climate action. Yet the externality itself has gone largely unexamined. Footnote 23. This chapter seeks to rectify that omission. The externality, it argues, offers a rich entry point to a political economic analysis of pollution, one that casts debates about environmental justice and moral responsibility in new light. The history of the externality is, at its heart, one of economists encountering the environment and seeking to grapple with and contain the effects of economic activity in the material world. Now, although neither of its two central theorists, that is, Arthur Pigou and Ronald Koch, was an environmental economist, the examples they use to illustrate the problem are teeming with nature, that is, air darkened by a smoky chimney, or purified by a leafy park, a field overrun with rabbits, cattle that stray from a rancher's field into a farmer's, a train whose sparking engine causes nearby woods to catch fire, a polluted stream with sickly fish, a building blocking the wind that powers a windmill. While externalities are not limited in environmental cases, they're fundamentally concerned with the unintended consequences of action in the material world, and so mark an iteration of the long-standing debate outlined in Chapter 2 about the relationship between intention and outcome, private and social interest, individual action, and collective action. Externalities also reveal something about markets as such. In systems of logic or infrastructure, it's often the points of failure that are most revealing, and this is no less true of the so-called market failure. Most theorists of the externality assume that individuals are the basic unit of economic analysis and markets the central institution. They treat markets in turn as an ideal type of allocation mechanism, a means by which goods or bads might be distributed via exchanges negotiated amongst individual actors, and assume markets should generally operate without intervention. But the condition of generalized market dependence, in which most people work for wages and obtain most of what they need to survive through exchange rather than through subsistence activity, is a unique and defining feature of capitalism, in particular as a system of political and economic organization. It is this condition that makes the prospect of market failure so threatening and so rich for political interrogation. Although externalities are frequently treated as an exception to the rule, they illuminate the rule of the market itself, that is, how markets are supposed to work, and what happens when they become the organizing institution of collective life. Next section, and let's see how close we are to the end. We are at the end. I will begin with a critical history of the externality tomorrow. Let me thank you for putting up with this silliness, and I will now shut the live stream off. Come on. And then